One of the reasons that I enjoy going to Sunday school each week here at Park Lake is because of the depth and the richness of the conversation and sharing and learning that takes place in the group and class that I'm a part of, but I know in the other class as well, the friendships and the sharing that emerge from there. But pretty regularly I find that that the conversation is so stimulating and so just getting you to think that it just completely turns my mind upside down, and I have a really hard time trying to remember what it was I wanted to say in the sermon this morning, or all of a sudden find myself reevaluating everything I wanted to say in the sermon this morning. So I recommend going to Sunday school to you. If you're not doing that, it's a marvelous activity, unless you're preaching right after that, and then you may want to take that Sunday off. But another reason that I enjoy the Sunday school classes so much is that every week, at some point during the class, inevitably somebody will say something. They'll share something about their own lives, what's going on, and what God is doing in their lives. Just a very, very clear and personal statement of their faith that pretty much keeps me going for the rest of the week. The power of that kind of faith sharing helps to center me again and to give me the fuel to keep moving ahead and to be re-energized in my own sense of faith and my own faith journey. So I'm very appreciative to everyone who does that. And if that's something that you're interested in, I encourage you to join one of our Sunday school classes here at Park Lake. I think we understand, if we think about things like that, how other people's lives impact us. We understand that in a very real way, none of us would probably be here in church this morning or gathered somewhere with others watching or participating online, or even if you're by yourself. You wouldn't be doing this activity if there hadn't been somebody in your life at some point or another who had, in a phrase, taken responsibility for God and somehow made God trustworthy and believable for you, simply because of the way they lived their own lives with such faithfulness and honesty and truth. All of us have that experience, I think, in some way or another. Even if you're a young person, you're saying to yourself, no, the reason I'm here is because Mom made me come this morning. You know, that pretty much is it. I promise you, at some point you'll reflect back on that, and you'll even see that kind of encouragement as a way that faith was shared with you, and the importance of that in understanding what we're doing here this morning, or why we're here this morning. Paul describes that in the letter to the Ephesians that Helen read just a minute earlier. He describes that with this phrase, the inheritance of the saints, the glorious inheritance that belongs to all of us. And he uses that word 3 times. We have obtained an inheritance. We have this pledge of our inheritance toward redemption as God's own people. These are the riches of God's glorious inheritance. I think that what Paul would say to us and help to put a label on the experience I've tried to describe is that, you know, what you're doing is you're living out of your inheritance. You're living on your inheritance. Sometimes we might say that with a little bit of judgment, as though we're living off of something somebody else had done, and we're not living off of what we had earned or put into life. And Paul says, no, that's completely the wrong idea. In fact, this is what I think you're called to do as Christians, is to live out of the inheritance that you've been given. And then he describes the inheritance in a very kind of long and lengthy sentence in this passage. What is the inheritance? Our inheritance is God's plan and God's purpose for us. Our inheritance is the hope that we are able to have in Christ. Our inheritance is living in praise and glory to God. Our inheritance is the word of truth. Our inheritance is the gospel of our salvation. Our inheritance is the experience of this Spirit which seals that for us. Our inheritance is our redemption as God's own people, our growth in our relationship with Christ, the hope to which we've been called. Our inheritance is knowledge and understanding of the power which raised Jesus Christ from the dead, the power of God which established Christ as Lord of all, the power of God which makes us an expression of Christ's body and fills us and fills everything with Christ, whom Paul says fills all in all. This is the glorious inheritance of the saints. This is what Paul says we need to be living out of today. Live on this inheritance. Somebody might say, look at my inheritance. Look at everything I've done. Look at all that I have. And that's just the exact opposite of what Paul says. Paul says living out of our inheritance is remembering the saints who, by simply being themselves, unself-conscious, steady, consistent in their manner of service and in their love and living for God's praise and glory, these are the people for whom the truthfulness and the proclamation of God's love has taken shape in your life. These are the people through whom a light shines that changes the landscape of your lives and the world around us and open to us the possibility that things might be different, that you and I can change, that you and I ourselves can begin to live within this world that shines with the glorious inheritance of these saints. And if we're called by Paul to live out of this glorious inheritance, then it does us some good every once in a while to remember these lives and to think about these lives through whom this light shines and who are so important to us and has such a role in who we are. Helen began that by talking with the kids a little bit about the saints, and I've done it before on this particular Sunday, and I want to do it for just a minute now. Some of these saints have come to my mind during these weeks. You may know them and you may not. One name that, and I have no explanation why, that came to my mind was the name of an older gentleman named Carl Traver. When I came back to Park Lake in 1993, when Helen and I came back, I thought Carl Traver was ancient then. He wasn't really that old, but he was just a kind of nice little gentleman that looked like he had been ancient all of his life. Just kind of moved through life like that with a slowness, with a steadiness, with a gentility about him, with a gentlemanliness. He was a lovely, lovely human being, but a very, very modest human being, a simple human being, simple, steady, consistent in his manner of service and love. When we came back to Park Lake, Carl, whose wife had died a few years earlier, had sold his small bungalow over in College Park and moved over to Winter Park Towers. And he always loved to tell the story of how Chet Burris Sr. and Cliff Duty and Corb Sarche, elders within this church, walked him through the steps of seeing if he would have enough to make ends meet, of helping him to sell his house so he could move over into the towers. And he always told that story with a kind of wonder and a kind of amazement. And when he moved into the towers, he consistently carried on a life there that he had been living all of his life, a life of service and volunteering. So we would get articles from Winter Park Towers periodically telling us all the things that Carl was doing. You know what he did? Every day he went to the nursing center and the assisted living center and helped ladies who needed to be in a wheelchair get in the wheelchair and go down to their hair appointments. That is a big deal. That is an important deal. He was the chauffeur to hair appointments at Winter Park Towers, and he did it year after year after year, day after day, and he did it with kindness and love and service. He did it so well that the Winter Park Towers made a special exception and gave him a little vest jacket that said something like Chief Volunteer, Chauffeur of Ladies to Hair Appointments. I'm making that part up, but he did have a vest that they gave him that he wore around and was recognized so often for all the things that he did. Here's a letter that Carl sent to the church, and his letters always came on pieces of paper that looked sort of like they had been mimeographed on a typewriter. And in this letter, he just says to the church, what he planned on doing in terms of volunteering, and he wanted to know the church to know his plans for his life. And he says, "So I will continue to volunteer the rest of my life while I live here, and my money to meet payments holds out. I accept no money or gratitude for my service." And he writes, refer to Romans chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. Let me tell you what that says. "We who are strong ought to put up with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Each of us must please our neighbor for the good purpose of building our neighbors up." Carl lived out of his inheritance, the inheritance of God's love, which enabled him to work for the good purpose of building up his neighbors. And then Cliff Duty, another one of the saints of the church, wrote Carl a little note reminding Carl of some of the things that Carl had sent him over the years. And Cliff wrote, "Carl, you sent me this nice little poem quite some time ago. For yesterday is but a dream and tomorrow is only a vision, but today well lived makes yesterday a dream of happiness and every tomorrow a vision of hope. You sent this to me when I was ill with heart problems and cancer, etc. As you know, I collect a mishmash of things myself, so here is something I want to send back to you. Our lives are filled with simple things and blessings without end, and one of the greatest joys in life is to have and be a friend." This was from Ernie Hauser, who also lived in Orlando. Carl and Cliff, two gentlemen who were living out of the inheritance of the saints, who were generating the inheritance of the saints that you and I continue to live out today. When I would go to see Carl over at Winter Park Towers, he was so excited to show me his room. I don't even know if they have rooms like this. I think it was a room for Spartans at the time. It was just one single room, and he had one little cot bed, and he had one little lamp, and he had one little end table next to it. But he was as proud could be about it. And he liked to show me, pull open the drawer on that end table, and you know what the drawer of that end table was filled with? Old Royal typewriter ribbons that he was saving and using over and over and over again. That's why that letter always looked like something that had been mimeographed that came to the church. But consistent, genuinely living out of his own sense of humbleness, his own sense of deep stewardship, caring for and helping others. And another name that came to my mind during this week was the name of a man named Charles or Chuck Gabrielson. People here at the church called him Gabe. And he was married to Elaine Gabrielson. And they were wonderful people. They were youth group leaders here for years and years. And they had two nice young boys, Chuck and Jimmy. They were so instrumental in my own time here when I was a summer youth intern. And I've been thinking about what it was about Mr. Gabrielson, Gabe, that was so important to me. And the best way that I could summarize it is I thought he was really cool. I thought he was just a dashing figure. He wore a khaki suit all the time, not unlike John Walker's suit here this morning. And I thought that was the most handsome thing I'd ever seen. I hadn't seen people wear a khaki suit like that and a blue shirt and nice tie. He was so highly respected by everyone. His sense of calm and his sense of presence just generated a sense of security and authority. He was a leader in the church. He was a leader amongst the youth. And you know what he did? He had the ability to take a group of high school students, a large group of high school students, and crew a sailboat and sail from Miami over to the Bahamas, on which David Simmons and others went on the trip. And it was a good trip, and it was a safe trip because of Mr. Gabrielson and his ability and his wisdom and his sense of steadiness throughout life. And thinking about Mr. Gabrielson reminded me of those things. Some of you, I'm sure, know and experienced the tragic day when Mr. Gabrielson, who was an avid bike rider, early in the morning was killed in a bicycle accident over by the old Naval Hospital, over by the old Naval Training Center. Just a tragedy, just a loss to this church and to his family. And yet we live off of his inheritance. We live off of the gift of his faith and his witness. And the reason I remember that and think about that now, is because of the word of his daughter-in-law, Angie Gabrielson. Angie was one of the members of the youth group when Mr. Gabe and his wife Elaine were the youth group leaders, and she went on some of those boat trips. She was probably a classmate of David Simmons and others at Winter Park High School. Angie married Chuck Gabrielson, their son, and they have a long and wonderful marriage and relationship. Chuck has served in the Army, now retired. They live in Northern Virginia. They have 2 adult daughters, both of whom are married and have grandchildren. One of their daughters, though, suffers from a rare neurological disorder called moya disease. And Angie has been saintly in her care for her daughter, and her witness to the struggle of her daughter, and her holding up her daughter in prayer and in faith throughout the community of the church and friends across the country. And I see this and know this so often through many of the posts which she puts on Facebook. And she put a post on Facebook at the beginning of this week in which she said, one of my friends in this network of support for the moya disease has challenged me and others to a month of gratitude. To a month of gratitude where we try to remember things that we're grateful as a way of support. And Angie wrote in her post, if I am fully transparent, this feels very hard to do in the face of my daughter's struggles. But gratitude fuels faith. Faith gives me the endurance to keep going. And Jesus assures me my daughter won't suffer endlessly. And then she writes of what she feels grateful for. There is so much to feel grateful for. Today I'm grateful for Jennifer Bond for inviting me to go with her to youth group. I'm grateful for my youth group leaders, Charles Gabrielson and Elaine Gabrielson, who later married a wonderful man, Ted Sismankowitz. I'm grateful to them for making me excited about going to church. And I'm grateful for my Sunday school teachers, Jim and Sandy Bogner, who taught me lessons that I still lean on today. I wanted Jim and Sandy to hear that, who were here in the choir, to know that we're living off of the inheritance which they helped create so many years ago, teaching Sunday school to high schoolers when their own children were small. And I'm grateful to Park Lake Presbyterian Church for laying a foundation of faith that has kept my house standing through some difficult days. Thank you. Friends, I lived off of that all week long. I think I'm going to be able to live off of it for quite a while. I think it reminded me of the inheritance that we share together. This glorious inheritance of the saints. The saints that we've known in years past. The saints that we know now. The saints will gather around a table with and share this meal from one who says, come and see, take and eat. Amen.